Right now, meteorologists at AccuWeather are watching a stretch of ocean between the southwestern Atlantic and the eastern Gulf of Mexico, and they have circled one window on the calendar with real concern: August 5th through August 15th. That is the period when stalled fronts and dropping wind shear could turn a quiet patch of tropical water into the next serious threat to the United States coastline. This is not speculation pulled from nowhere. It is the direct assessment of Alex De Silva, AccuWeather's lead hurricane expert, who has spent years tracking exactly these kinds of setups before they turn into landfalling hurricanes. And the reason this particular window matters so much is that it comes right as the Atlantic hurricane season is about to shift out of first gear and into something far more dangerous. Here's the situation as it stands. The 2026 Atlantic hurricane season has already produced 2 named storms. Arthur formed first, then Bertha followed, and both of them made landfall along the Gulf Coast. That alone tells you something important. In a season that forecasters have repeatedly described as near normal to even slightly below normal in overall storm count, it is not the number of storms that decides whether a season becomes historic. It is whether even one of those storms finds the right conditions at the right time, over the right patch of ocean, and explodes into something far larger than anyone expected just days earlier. That is exactly the pattern forecasters are now watching build. To understand why this window is different from the quiet weeks that came before it, you have to understand what has been holding this season back in the first place. A powerful El Niño pattern is developing in the eastern Pacific Ocean, and models now suggest an 80 to 90% chance that it strengthens into a significant event before summer is over. El Niño works by warming water near the equator in the Pacific, and that warming ripples outward, changing wind patterns across the entire globe. In the Atlantic basin specifically, a strong El Niño usually means more wind shear, the high-altitude crosswinds that tear apart a young tropical storm before it has the chance to organize into something dangerous. This is why Colorado State University's hurricane research team, one of the most respected forecasting groups in the country, is projecting a below-average number of major hurricane landfalls on the continental United States and in the Caribbean this year. Their April forecast called for 13 named storms, 6 hurricanes, and 2 major hurricanes, a number that sits below the long-term average for a typical Atlantic season. But here's the paradox, and it is the single most important thing to understand about why this particular week matters. El Niño suppresses storms on average, across the whole basin, over the whole season. It does not eliminate the danger in any specific location on any specific day. Even during a below-average season, there are pockets where the atmosphere temporarily relaxes, where the wind shear that has been shredding storms elsewhere briefly drops away, and where the ocean underneath is warm enough to fuel rapid, explosive development the moment that shear disappears. That is precisely the setup AccuWeather is flagging for the first 2 weeks of August. The wind shear across most of the Atlantic basin remains hostile, and the Caribbean in particular is expected to stay chopped up by shear through the middle of the month, which is typical in an El Niño year. But in the southwestern Atlantic and the eastern Gulf, forecasters expect 1 or 2 frontal systems to stall out, and when a front stalls, it can create a temporary corridor of lighter winds aloft. If a tropical wave or disturbance rides into that corridor at the same time the Gulf's exceptionally warm water is sitting there waiting to be used as fuel, the ingredients for something serious come together very quickly. This is not the first time forecasters have pointed to the warmth of the Gulf and the Western Caribbean as the wild card for this season. Meteorologists tracking the broader pattern for 2026 have specifically noted that tropical waves crossing the Atlantic from Africa may stay weak and disorganized for most of their journey, only to reach the Western Caribbean or the Gulf and rapidly intensify once they arrive over that unusually warm water. In other words, the storms most likely to catch people off guard this year are not the ones that announce themselves days in advance while still out over the open ocean. They are the ones that look unremarkable right up until the moment they reach the warmest water near the U.S. coastline, and then intensify in a matter of hours rather than days. That pattern of sudden rapid intensification close to the coast is exactly what has made the last several hurricane seasons so much more destructive than their raw storm counts would suggest. It is worth remembering that last year's season, while close to the historical average in terms of overall named storms, still produced 3 separate Category 5 hurricanes, just one shy of tying the all-time record for a single season. Multiple systems went through what meteorologists call rapid intensification, getting 35 miles per hour or more in sustained wind speed within a 24-hour period, sometimes doubling their destructive potential in less than a day and a half. And critically, most of that explosive activity did not happen in the quiet early weeks of the season. It happened after September 10th, the historical peak of hurricane season, when ocean heat content across the basin is at its annual maximum, and the atmosphere is primed for storms to feed rapidly on what is essentially an ocean-sized reservoir of stored energy. This year, the setup is slightly different, but arguably just as concerning in its own way. Because El Niño is expected to strengthen as the season progresses, some forecasters believe the overall storm count could actually taper off in the back half of the season, shifting more of the year's total activity earlier than usual. That means the first couple of weeks in August, right as this watch area becomes active, could carry more relative importance this year than in a typical season, simply because the window of opportunity for storms to form and strengthen unimpeded may be narrower than usual. Instead of a long, drawn-out ramp toward a September and October peak, this year could see a compressed period of higher risk crammed into a shorter stretch of the calendar, and the first 2 weeks of August look like they could be part of that compressed window. It helps to step back and look at where the two named storms of this season made landfall, because that geography lines up directly with where forecasters say the greatest risk remains concentrated. Arthur and Bertha both came ashore along the Gulf Coast. AccuWeather has specifically flagged the northern and eastern Gulf Coast and the Carolinas as areas carrying a higher than average risk of a direct impact for the remainder of the season, along with the northeastern Caribbean. That is a wide stretch of coastline running from the Florida Panhandle and the central Gulf states, across the Florida Peninsula, and up through the entire Carolina coastline. It includes some of the most densely populated coastal regions in the country, along with some of the most vulnerable low-lying areas anywhere in North America. There is also a broader climate signal underneath all of this that is worth taking seriously, separate from any single storm or any single season. Gulf of Mexico. Water temperatures have been trending warmer over the past several decades, and warmer water is quite simply higher octane fuel for a hurricane. A tropical system pulls its energy directly from the heat stored in the upper layers of the ocean. When that water is unusually warm, and especially when the warmth extends to greater depths rather than just sitting in a thin surface layer, a storm passing overhead does not just get a boost. It can undergo the kind of rapid intensification that has become almost a signature of the last several hurricane seasons. Hurricane Michael in 2018 strengthened into a catastrophic Category 5 storm in the hours before it struck the Florida Panhandle, catching forecasters and residents by surprise with how quickly it escalated. Hurricane Ian in 2022 underwent a similar burst of rapid strengthening in the Gulf before devastating southwest Florida. Hurricane Otis in the eastern Pacific in 2023 went from a modest tropical storm to a catastrophic Category 5 hurricane in about 24 hours, an intensification rate that stunned even veteran meteorologists and left virtually no time for the city of Acapulco to prepare. These are not freak, one-off anomalies anymore. They represent a pattern, and the warm water sitting in the Gulf of Mexico and the Western Caribbean right now is the same kind of fuel source that powered every one of those storms. This is why meteorologists keep repeating the same warning, season after season, no matter what the official numerical forecast says. It only takes one storm hitting the wrong place at the wrong time to turn an otherwise ordinary or even quiet season into one of the most destructive on record. Hurricane Michael's season, overall, was not considered a hyperactive year by storm count. Hurricane Andrew, one of the most devastating hurricanes ever to strike Florida, formed during a season with comparatively modest overall activity. Meteorologists at AccuWeather made almost exactly this point earlier this year, stressing that people from South Texas all the way up to Maine need to prepare with the same seriousness every single season, regardless of what the official outlook predicts, because even a slightly below average year can still produce a major, life-altering hit somewhere along that coastline. So, what does the actual data tell us about what could happen if a system does organize in that early August window? Right now, there's no guarantee that anything will develop at all. Forecasters have been careful and precise in their language, describing this as an area to monitor rather than a confirmed threat, and that distinction matters. Meteorology at this range is about probabilities and favorable conditions, not certainties. But the ingredients being discussed are real and specific. Stalled frontal boundaries can act almost like a spinning top, providing the initial spin and lift that a disorganized cluster of thunderstorms needs to begin organizing into a tropical depression. Lower wind shear removes the mechanism that would otherwise tear that organization apart before it has a chance to consolidate. And warm water, sitting right there in the eastern Gulf and the western Atlantic, provides the fuel that turns a weak, sprawling system into a compact, intensifying one. When all three of those ingredients line up at once, the transition from a nondescript cluster of storms to a named system with a defined center and increasingly organized wind field can happen surprisingly fast, sometimes within 48 hours. That speed is the single biggest reason coastal residents are urged not to wait for a storm to already exist before they start preparing. History has shown over and over that the systems which catch people the most off guard are not the ones that spend a leisurely week crossing the open Atlantic while every model run gets refined and every news outlet tracks its progress. They are the ones that spin up quickly, close to shore, sometimes giving coastal communities only a handful of days, or even less, between the moment a system becomes officially named and the moment it makes landfall as a much stronger hurricane. When that compressed timeline collides with a coastline that has not yet stocked supplies, has not reviewed an evacuation route, and has not made a family communication plan, the results tend to be far worse than they need to be. The tools available to forecasters today are also worth understanding, because they explain why a watch area like this one can be identified so far in advance, sometimes weeks before a single cloud cluster has organized into anything resembling a storm. Geostationary satellites orbiting far above the equator provide a continuous, unblinking view of the entire Atlantic basin, updating images every few minutes and allowing meteorologists to watch the birth of a tropical wave as it rolls off the African coast, long before it ever reaches the warm waters of the Caribbean or the Gulf. Once the system shows signs of organizing, the Air Force's Hurricane Hunter aircraft fly directly into the storm, dropping instruments called dropsondes that measure wind speed, pressure, and temperature from the top of the storm all the way down to the ocean surface. That direct in-storm data is combined with dozens of computer models, each one built on slightly different mathematical assumptions about how the atmosphere behaves, and forecasters synthesize all of those competing model outputs into the single official forecast that eventually reaches the public. When a private company like AccuWeather flags a specific 10-day window weeks in advance, it is because those models, running on supercomputers and fed by satellite data, are already showing a consistent signal, even if the actual disturbance that will exploit that signal has not yet formed. This kind of long-range pattern recognition has become dramatically more reliable over just the past 2 decades, and that improvement matters enormously for anyone living along a hurricane-prone coastline. Forecast tracks that used to carry enormous uncertainty 5 days out are now, on average, considerably more accurate than they were a generation ago. That leap in accuracy is the direct result of better satellites, more powerful computing, and a much larger historical data set of past storms for models to learn from. But there is an important asterisk attached to all of that progress. While track forecasting, meaning the ability to predict where a storm will go, has improved enormously, intensity forecasting, meaning the ability to predict exactly how strong a storm will become, remains a much harder scientific problem. Rapid intensification events, like the ones that turned Hurricane Michael and Hurricane Otis into catastrophic storms in a matter of hours, remain notoriously difficult for models to capture precisely because they depend on small-scale processes inside the storm's core that are still not fully understood even by the scientists who study them for a living. That gap between excellent track forecasting and imperfect intensity forecasting is precisely why coastal residents are urged to prepare for the worst reasonable outcome, rather than the most likely one, since the storm that arrives on your coastline may end up considerably stronger than the storm that was originally forecast just 2 or 3 days earlier. It is also worth understanding the mechanics of what actually makes a hurricane dangerous, because wind speed alone tells only part of the story. Storm surge, the wall of ocean water pushed ashore by a hurricane's winds and low pressure, is responsible for a large share of hurricane deaths in the United States, and it can inundate coastal areas well before the strongest winds ever arrive. A storm does not need to be a Category 5 to produce a lethal storm surge. The shape of the coastline, the angle of approach, the size of the storm's wind field all matter as much as the category number that gets reported in headlines. Rainfall is the other major hazard, and it is arguably becoming the more consistently deadly one across the country as a whole. Slow-moving tropical systems, or storms that stall out after landfall, can dump a year's worth of rain on a single region in a matter of days, as Houston learned catastrophically when Hurricane Harvey stalled over the city in 2017 and dropped more than 50 inches of rain in some locations. Inland flooding from a weakening tropical system can travel hundreds of miles from the coast, meaning that communities that never see a drop of storm surge and never experience hurricane-force winds can still face life-threatening flash flooding and river flooding for days after the storm has technically been downgraded. This is exactly why the forecast cone that meteorologists publish for every storm comes with an explicit warning that is often overlooked. That cone shows the probable path of the storm center, with roughly a 60 to 70% chance that the center stays within the shaded area. It does not represent the full extent of the storm's impacts. Tropical storm and hurricane conditions, along with dangerous flooding, can extend hundreds of miles beyond the edges of that cone. Communities well outside the forecast track have been blindsided by tornado outbreaks spawned by a hurricane's outer rain bands, and by flash flooding from rainfall that extended far past where the center of circulation ever traveled. Understanding that distinction is one of the most important pieces of hurricane literacy any coastal or even inland resident can have, because it means that being outside the cone is never, by itself, a reason to assume you are safe. Given all of that, what should residents across the Gulf Coast, the Florida Peninsula, and the Carolinas actually be doing right now, in the days before this watch window even opens up? The advice from emergency management officials and meteorologists is remarkably consistent, and none of it requires waiting for a storm to actually be named. Review your evacuation zone and know, specifically, whether your home sits in a zone that would be ordered to evacuate ahead of even a moderate storm, because storm surge risk depends heavily on elevation and proximity to the coast, not just on how far away the storm currently sits. Assemble or refresh a basic emergency supply kit, including enough non-perishable food and water for every member of the household, along with pets for a minimum of several days, since power outages and supply chain disruptions can persist well after the storm itself has passed. Make sure important documents, from insurance policies to identification, are secured in a waterproof container or digitally backed up, because the paperwork required to file an insurance claim or apply for federal assistance becomes far harder to produce after a home has flooded. Fuel up vehicles and generators before a storm is bearing down, since gas stations along evacuation routes can run dry within hours once a warning is issued, and a full tank ahead of time removes a major source of last-minute panic and gridlock. Beyond individual preparation, it is worth understanding how the broader forecasting apparatus in the United States actually works, because the information reaching the public passes through a chain of highly specialized institutions before it ever appears in a news alert. The National Hurricane Center in Miami is the official source for storm advisories, watches, and warnings for the Atlantic Basin, and its forecasters issue a formal tropical weather outlook every day during hurricane season, discussing any areas of disturbed weather and estimating their probability of development over the following 2 to 7 days. Private forecasting companies like AccuWeather run their own long-range models and often flag potential development areas even before the National Hurricane Center formally raises its own probability numbers, which is exactly why this particular Gulf and southwestern Atlantic watch area has been in the news well before any storm has actually formed there. Universities like Colorado State University contribute independent seasonal outlooks built on decades of historical storm data and current oceanic and atmospheric conditions, and their forecasts get updated multiple times throughout the season as new information becomes available, with their next update expected in early August, right around the same time this watch window opens. It is also worth putting the naming convention itself into context, since names can sometimes create a false sense of familiarity or a false sense of danger, depending on how a storm has been covered in the media. The official 2026 Atlantic storm name list runs from Arthur through Wilfred, following the standard alphabetical rotation used every year, skipping letters that are difficult to use for storm names. If a storm were to develop out of this early August watch area, the next name on the list would be Cristobal, following Arthur and Bertha. A name by itself tells you nothing about a storm's intensity. Some of the most destructive hurricanes in American history carried names that sound almost gentle, and while some very weak, short-lived tropical storms have carried names that sound far more ominous. The letter and the name are simply next in a rotating alphabetical sequence. The actual danger a storm poses has to be assessed independently, based on its size, its forward speed, its intensity, and the vulnerability of whatever coastline it is approaching. There's a reason this story deserves attention now, even before any storm has fully organized, rather than waiting until a name and a category number are already attached to it. The entire value of long-range hurricane forecasting is that it buys time, and time is the single most valuable resource anyone has when a serious storm is approaching. Emergency managers consistently say that the households and communities who fare the best during a hurricane are not the ones who react fastest once a warning is issued. They are the ones who already had a plan in place well before the storm existed, so that when a warning finally does come, the only thing left to do is execute a plan rather than build one from scratch under pressure. That is exactly the opportunity this watch window represents. Nothing is formed yet. Nothing is guaranteed to form at all. But the specific combination of conditions that forecasters are watching, stalled fronts, dropping wind shear, and exceptionally warm water sitting in the Gulf and the southwestern Atlantic, is precisely the kind of setup that has, in year after year of hurricane history, produced the storms that go on to make the biggest headlines. There is a psychological pattern that emergency managers and social scientists have documented repeatedly across decades of hurricane response, and it is worth naming directly because it tends to be the single biggest factor separating communities that weather a storm well from communities that suffer needlessly. It is often called hurricane fatigue, and it develops naturally in places that get named storm watches or warnings issued frequently without a major landfall actually occurring. After several near misses or minor impacts, residents understandably begin to discount the next warning, assuming that this one too will pass without serious consequence. That pattern of discounting repeated warnings has directly contributed to tragically low evacuation compliance in several past storms, including cases where a storm that forecasters had accurately flagged as dangerous still caught large numbers of residents unprepared, simply because previous warnings in prior seasons had not materialized into the worst-case outcome. The lesson meteorologists draw from this pattern is not that people are careless, but that probability-based forecasting is inherently difficult to communicate in a way that sustains urgency over multiple seasons. And it places extra responsibility on both forecasters and residents to treat each new watch area on its own evidence rather than assuming that past quiet outcomes predict future ones. The watch window now being discussed for the Gulf and southwestern Atlantic deserves to be evaluated on the specific data behind it, the wind shear numbers, the sea surface temperatures, and the frontal boundary forecasts, rather than being dismissed simply because the two storms that have already formed this season made landfall without producing catastrophic damage. It is also worth remembering that hurricane risk in the United States has never been confined only to the immediate coastline, even though coastal communities understandably receive the most attention in initial coverage. Hurricane Helene in 2024 demonstrated this with devastating clarity, when the storm's remnants dumped catastrophic rainfall across the mountains of western North Carolina, an area hundreds of miles from where the storm made landfall and hundreds of feet above sea level, triggering flash flooding and landslides that killed dozens of people in communities that had never considered themselves at meaningful hurricane risk. That single event fundamentally changed how many inland communities across the Southeast think about hurricane preparedness, expanding the conversation well beyond storm surge and beachfront evacuation zones to include river flooding, mountain terrain flash flooding, and the kind of catastrophic rainfall that a weakening tropical system can still produce long after its winds have dropped below hurricane strength. Anyone living within a few hundred miles of the Gulf Coast or the Carolina coastline, even well inland, has a direct stake in how this developing watch area plays out, not just the residents standing directly on the beach. Zoom out, and the picture for the rest of the 2026 season becomes clearer. Forecasters are not predicting a hyperactive year in terms of sheer storm count, and the developing El Niño pattern gives good scientific reason to expect fewer storms overall than average, concentrated primarily in the back half of the season when Pacific warming reaches its peak influence on global wind patterns. But a below-average storm count has never been a guarantee of a quiet or low-impact season on the ground. And this year's early activity, with 2 landfalling systems already on the books before the traditional climatological peak of the season has even arrived, suggests that whatever development does occur may be more likely to find its way toward the U.S. coastline rather than staying out over open water. The specific window now being flagged from the 5th through the 15th of August sits directly astride the point in the calendar when the first hurricane of an average Atlantic season typically forms, and just a few weeks ahead of when the first major hurricane usually develops. In other words, this watch area is not some exotic or unusual outlier on the calendar. It falls squarely within the part of the season when history says the odds of real development begin rising sharply, and it happens to align with the exact region where forecasters say conditions are most likely to briefly turn favorable this year. None of this is meant to generate panic over a system that, as of right now, does not even exist as an organized tropical disturbance. It is meant to convey exactly what meteorologists themselves are conveying: a specific, evidence-based reason to pay close attention to the Gulf of Mexico and the southwestern Atlantic over the first 2 weeks of August, grounded in real atmospheric patterns rather than vague seasonal anxiety. The wind shear numbers, the sea surface temperatures, the frontal boundary forecasts, and the historical timing of the season's first hurricane are all specific, measurable pieces of data that professional forecasters are using right now to make this call. When the people whose entire job is tracking these systems for a living start pointing at a specific 10-day window and a specific stretch of ocean, months of professional experience are behind that judgment, not guesswork. There is also an economic dimension to this story that rarely gets the same attention as the wind speeds and the rainfall totals, but that shapes the lives of coastal residents for years after any given storm has passed. Insurance markets along the Gulf Coast and in Florida have already been under significant strain over the past several years, with multiple private insurers pulling back from high-risk coastal counties or raising premiums sharply enough that some homeowners have been forced onto state-backed insurers of last resort. A single major hurricane making landfall in a densely populated stretch of coastline can generate tens of billions of dollars in insured losses in a matter of hours, and the ripple effects of that kind of event tend to show up in premium increases and coverage changes across the entire region, not just in the specific neighborhoods that were directly hit. That means the stakes of this early August watch window extend well beyond the immediate physical safety of anyone in the storm's direct path. A significant landfalling hurricane in an already fragile insurance market can reshape the cost of homeownership for an entire region for years afterward, influencing everything from mortgage requirements to property values, to whether residents can even find affordable coverage at all going forward. The broader economy of a region also absorbs damage that often goes unmeasured in the initial headlines about wind speed and storm category. Ports along the Gulf Coast handle a significant share of the nation's oil and gas production and refining capacity, and a direct hit on that infrastructure can send ripples through fuel prices nationally, not just regionally. Agricultural regions across the southeast, still recovering in some cases from previous season's storms, can lose entire harvests to high winds and flooding within a single afternoon. Small businesses, particularly along the coastline where tourism and hospitality make up a large share of local employment, often take the longest to recover, since a damaged storefront or a flooded restaurant can mean months without income even after the physical rebuilding is complete. None of this is meant to overshadow the human toll, which is always the most important measure of any storm's impact, but it explains why emergency planners, insurance regulators, and local governments treat every hurricane season with the same level of seriousness regardless of the seasonal forecast number, because the downstream economic consequences of even a single storm can outlast the storm itself by years. For residents along the Gulf Coast, the Florida Peninsula, and the Carolinas in particular, the message is straightforward, and it does not require waiting for a storm to actually materialize before acting on it. Treat the coming 2 weeks as a natural checkpoint to make sure your hurricane plan is current, your supplies are stocked, and your family knows exactly what to do if a watch or a warning is issued with only a few days of notice. Keep an eye on official updates from the National Hurricane Center, since any organized system that does develop in this window will be tracked continuously with regularly updated forecast cones, intensity estimates, and specific watches or warnings for any coastline under threat. And remember the pattern that keeps repeating across hurricane seasons in the era of a warming Gulf of Mexico? It is rarely the storm that spends a week crawling across the open Atlantic that catches communities unprepared. It is the one that spins up quickly and quietly, close to home, over water that is sitting there right now, warmer than it used to be, and ready to turn a modest disturbance into a serious hurricane faster than anyone expects. Whether or not this particular window produces that storm, the setup being described right now is exactly the kind of setup that has, time and again, turned into exactly that story. Stay informed, stay ready, and treat the next 2 weeks as the moment to finish preparing rather than the moment to start.